Good afternoon. I'm Dennis Galucki. Welcome to the 527th Imagine Greater Buffalo program and our 149th YouTube Imagine Buffalo program, hosted by our wonderful Buffalo and Erie County Public Library. Thanks for joining us today. This program is created by the Center for the Study of Art, Architecture, History, and Nature, and ImagineLifelongLearning.com. Now, before we get started, just a little housekeeping. Everyone watching will be muted and your video turned off. If you have a question or comment, please type it into the chat box and we'll go through them at the end of the presentation. We are recording this program so you can watch it again later on the Downtown Central Library's Facebook page and YouTube channels. And please share the link with others. Now on to our featured speaker. Tom Reigstad is a fourth-generation Buffalonian. He earned degrees in literature and education at SUNY Buffalo, the University of Missouri, and Canisius College. Tom was a features writer and copy editor at the Buffalo Courier-Express and Niagara Falls Gazette. He is now an emeritus professor of English at Buffalo State University. In 2023, Tom received the Owen B. Augsburger Award for Outstanding Service in the Cause of Local History from our great Buffalo History Museum. He is the author of Scribbling for a Living, Mark Twain's Pivotal Period in Buffalo, and his new book, The Illustrated Mark Twain and the Buffalo Express. It's being released today. Perfect timing. Tom, welcome. Take it away.
Thank you, Dennis. Good afternoon, everyone. I'm pleased to talk to you today about Mark Twain and Buffalo and my books about Twain's rich association with our city. I'm speaking today from the Central Library at Lafayette Square, one floor above the Mark Twain Room, a must-see spot for Twain enthusiasts. The current exhibit at the Mark Twain Room is Twins of Genius and a tour that Mark Twain and his friend George Washington Cable embarked on together, speaking on stages all across the Northeast, Canada, the Midwest in 1884, including December of 1884 in Buffalo. So please visit the Mark Twain Room. Since our chilly February winds are blowing in Buffalo, and there is still some snow on the ground from last weekend, I will share a fairly popular photograph of Twain that, let's see here, that pops up in some biographies. It shows him proudly sporting a heavy sealskin fur coat and cap. What is rarely mentioned, however, is that he bought this winter outfit in Buffalo for $250 in September of 1871 at Berthold & Brothers Furrier at 291 Main Street, right around the corner from his Buffalo Express office. 2 months later, Twain bragged that his new Buffalo winter gear had kept him warm during a frigid December visit to Chicago. As Twain put it, "It was a crisp, bitter day, but all days are alike in my sealskin coat. I can only tell it is cold by my nose and by seeing other people's actions." Years later, his literary pal, William Dean Howells, recalled walking down New York City's Broadway with Twain, drawing crowds to admire that same sealskin coat. So yes, Twain knew the best place to shop in order to prepare for winter, Buffalo. Before I talk about my new book, The Illustrated Mark Twain and the Buffalo Express, 10 stories and over a century of sketches, let me provide a thumbnail sketch of Twain's life in Buffalo. In August of 1869, 33-year-old journalist Samuel Clemens, already known by his pen name Mark Twain, moved to Buffalo. Now, why Buffalo? Well, 2 years earlier, in 1867, as a San Francisco newspaper reporter, he convinced his editor to pay his expenses to join a 6-month excursion with wealthy Americans crossing the Atlantic Ocean to tour Europe and the Middle East. Twain was obligated to send 50 travel letters back to the newspaper during his subsidized trip. While on board ship, he befriended 18-year-old fellow excursionist Charlie Langdon of Elmira, New York. At some point, Charlie showed Twain a small portrait of his older sister, Olivia. Now, supposedly, Twain fell in love at first sight. Of course, it had nothing to do with the fact that Charlie and Olivia were the children of Jervis Langdon, a multi-million-dollar coal dealer in Elmira. Eventually, in February of 1869, Twain and Olivia became engaged. And by mid-July, Twain published The Innocents Abroad, a much expanded compilation of his newspaper letters about traveling through Europe and the Holy Land. The book, hilarious, satirical, irreverent, was a huge success, still considered to be America's first nonfiction bestseller. By the end of the summer of 1869, Twain's future father-in-law convinced him to join the Buffalo Express newspaper as co-owner and managing editor. In fact, his future father-in-law, Jervis, gave him the money to become co-owner of the paper. Here is Olivia Langdon, who is 10 years younger than Twain. This is how she looked around the time of their marriage. As an engaged bachelor in the fall of 1869, Twain worked long hours writing and editing stories at the Buffalo Express, located at 14 East Swan Street. The Express was a morning newspaper, one of 3 prosperous dailies at the time. There was the Buffalo Express, the Daily Commercial Advertiser, and the Daily Courier. They published 6 days a week. There were no Sunday editions in those days. Twain's cubbyhole office was on the 3rd floor. I'll put my cursor there. This is the Courier building on the north side of East Swan Street. This white building here is on Main Street, and the Express building right here was on the block between Main Street and Washington. My cursor here is at Washington. So all of these buildings were between Main Street and Washington on East Swan. And this middle window on the 3rd floor was Twain's office in 1869 and 1870, overlooking busy East Swan Street. Reporters and editors shared his 3rd floor. The compositors, the layout people, were on the 4th floor. The business offices occupied the first 2 floors, and the printing presses were located in the basement. So Twain frequently, since the paper was a morning paper, he frequently worked into the wee hours, well past midnight, correcting and reading proofs, and then shepherding the first edition of the paper for distribution in the morning. In the fall of 1869, as a bachelor engaged to be married, Twain lived in a 1-room apartment at Mrs. Randall's boarding house on 39 East Swan Street, which is circled there. It was a former mansion refit into a boarding house. This is an 1870 photo taken from the steeple of St. Paul's Episcopal Church. It shows not only the boarding house, which I said is encircled there, but also you get a flavor for how densely populated Buffalo's downtown and waterfront areas were. befitting a town, a boom town of 120,000 people at that time. Now, Twain enjoyed staying at Mrs. Randall's boarding house. He liked her homemade biscuits, and he bragged about smoking about 8 cigars a day in his boarding house room. The boarding house was a convenient few steps away from the newspaper. Let me show on my cursor here. This is East Swan going toward Main Street. And this is Main Street going north on Main. This is Washington going north away from the waterfront. So right around in this area here was the Buffalo Express office at 14 East Swan. And here was his boarding house. So he could virtually fall out of bed and he'd be at work. By the way, at 291 Main Street, right around the corner from East Swan is one of these low buildings is 291 Berchtold Brothers Furriers, where Twain bought his famous sealskin coat and cap in 1871. Twain's bachelor days as an Express editor and reporter ended in early February of 1870 when he and Olivia were married in a private ceremony held in the Langdon Mansion in Elmira. The next day, a private train took Twain, Olivia, and a small wedding party to Buffalo, where on a magical snowy evening, they all were treated to the awesome sight of a surprise wedding gift presented to the newlyweds by Jervis Langdon, a handsome mansion on Buffalo's most prestigious Grand Boulevard, Delaware Street, as it was known then. The gift included servants, a carriage, sleigh, and horse. When Twain lived at 472 Delaware Street, located on the west side of Delaware, 2 houses north of Virginia, a massive factory, the Cornell White Lead Works, was located right across the street. On this map, you can see Twain's 472 Delaware property encircled here. This is Delaware Street going north on Delaware. This is Virginia going east toward Main Street. And right across the street from Twain's home was this massive grounds where the Cornell White Lead factory was located. And the factory operated 24/7, spewing a steady stream of toxic chemicals like arsenic billowing from its smokestacks, possibly affecting Olivia's health and pregnancy. After a near miscarriage in October of 1870, Olivia gave birth to a son, whom they named Langdon, more than 1 month prematurely. The baby was sickly and often near death during their remaining 4 months in Buffalo. Twain, his wife, and baby left Buffalo in March of 1871. In fact, Olivia, still ailing from the demands of caring for an ill infant and recovering from typhoid fever herself, had to be carried out of the house on a mattress to a waiting carriage that then took them to the Exchange Street station in downtown Buffalo and a train first to live in Elmira and then later on to a new home in Hartford, Connecticut. Their poor firstborn child later died at only 1.5 years of age. For more details on Twain's life in Buffalo, I welcome you to take a look at my 2018 book, Scribbling for a Living, Mark Twain's Pivotal Period in Buffalo, that Dennis mentioned in his introduction. My new book, there's Langdon. My new book, released today, The Illustrated Mark Twain and the Buffalo Express, 10 Stories and Over a Century of Sketches, reprints 10 of the 70 stories that Twain published in the Buffalo Express in 1869 and 1870, accompanied by over 30 illustrations drawn by artists in the 19th, 20th, and 21st centuries. In my early days of poking around in the Buffalo corner of Twain's life, I carefully read every page of every issue of the Buffalo Express from 1869 to 1871 on microfilm machines. I was surprised at that time to discover 6 drawings done by Twain's Buffalo Express colleague, John Harrison Mills. For some reason, generations of Twain scholars had completely overlooked Mills's illustrations. Mills was born and raised in Bowmansville and was a Civil War hero. This is Mills in his Civil War uniform and coat. The Express made a point of publicizing the innovation of supplementing Twain's stories with in-house drawings in advance of the publication of each story. Here's a lead-up ad for the Twain story in the fall of 1869, Journalism in Tennessee. And you'll note that the ad emphasizes that it's an illustrated sketch. You know, again, something quite unique at the time. There are 4 Twain stories in the Buffalo Express that John Harrison Mills illustrated. In addition to Journalism in Tennessee, there was and there's the story. Twain always made a point of publishing his feature stories on Saturdays for optimum subscribers and on the front page of the story of the paper. Another story that Twain wrote in the fall of 1869, which was a 2-parter that Mills illustrated, was A Day at Niagara, and then English Festivities in consecutive Saturday issues, based on a firsthand visit that Mark Twain made for the first time of Niagara Falls and the grounds, and even over on the Canadian side in late July of 1869. And they're hilarious, very satirical. The 4th story that John Harrison Mills illustrated in the pages of the Buffalo Express in the fall of 1869 was a Twain story called The Wild Man Interviewed, a really fanciful story about a made-up creature who had almost like Bigfoot, who had been around for eons and witnessed all sorts of key moments in the world's history. And Twain is interviewing him. All 4 stories and all 6 of Mills' drawings are in my new book, and Mills is the only artist ever to have illustrated Twain's Wild Man story. Now, in 1875, shortly after Twain left Buffalo, he published another book, Sketches New and Old, which was an anthology that included several of his original Buffalo Express stories. Each story in this 1875 book was accompanied by drawings done by famed engraver and illustrator Truman Williams. True Williams was born in Allegheny County and raised upstate. Twain really admired Williams's artistry and worked elbow to elbow with him as often as he could, approving the lavish illustrations that would appear in Twain's books. Williams indeed illustrated several of Twain's books, including The Adventures of Tom Sawyer, which was published in 1876. And here is Williams's iconic depiction of Tom Sawyer from that first edition of The Adventures of Tom Sawyer. My book includes all 17 of True Williams's beautifully executed original drawings of Twain's Express stories that were reprinted in the Sketches New and Old of 1875. After Twain moved into the Wedding Gift Mansion on Delaware Street in February of 1870, he handled most of his Buffalo Express duties as managing editor and writer remotely, not by laptop, of course, but by using a courier to relay his stories and editorial instructions to the newspaper office. But because he was pretty much housebound by choice, many of his story topics derived from his domestic and neighborhood experiences and observations, which takes us to 1978. Throughout that year, the Buffalo Courier Express, whose forerunner was Twain's own Buffalo Express, ran advertisements promoting its tradition of journalistic excellence dating way back to Twain's time on the paper. That rich tradition prompted a young Courier Express reporter in 1978 by the name of Michael Hiltzik to dig through the Courier archives for Twain's original Express stories. And from May through December of 1978, Hiltzik reprinted 4 original Express stories by Twain, one of them based on an IRS agent who visited his Delaware Street home. The stories, with introductions by Hiltzik and illustrations by an equally young Courier Express staff artist, recently graduated from the University of Buffalo, Tom Towles, appeared in the Courier Express Sunday magazine. My book reproduces, for the first time, Towles's 11 drawings from the 1978 Courier Express Sunday magazine series. The stories illustrated by Tom Towles are, I'll show you just a cover from the Courier Express Sunday magazine from 1978 and the table of contents to one of the issues, which if you look way at the bottom, Tom Towles is mentioned in the masthead, if you will, of the Sunday magazine as the design associate. He was still years away from becoming the editorial cartoonist at the Buffalo Courier Express. So stories that were reprinted in the 1978 Courier Sunday magazine with drawings by Towles included A Mysterious Visit, which is that hilarious story that True Williams also illustrated about the IRS agent calling on Twain at his new home. And Twain gets overly talkative about how much he's earned and bragging about it, and then tries to retract some of the information that he divulges when he realizes that he's talking to a tax man. Another of the stories reprinted in 1978 was More Distinction. It was a story based on or inspired by a colorful neighbor of Twain's further down Delaware Street, who kept chickens and lots of other creatures. Another of those stories in 1978 in the Courier was The Last Words of Great Men. Towles illustrated that. And I think it's the only time that that story was ever illustrated, with several done by Tom Towles. And then the last was The Fortifications of Paris, which I'll get to later. Towles did some illustrations for that one in 1978. Tom Towles, as you know, won the Pulitzer for editorial cartooning at the Buffalo Express. And later on, Michael Hiltzik was awarded a Pulitzer for his reporting at the Los Angeles Times. Next, in 1983, young cartoonist Bill Watterson was hired by the Mark Twain Journal to provide some drawings of Mark Twain. And Watterson's illustration for a postcard for the Mark Twain Journal was a scene from Twain's grisly but very comical Express story, Curious Dream, which is a 2-part story in the spring of 1870 in the Express, based on a deteriorating cemetery called the North Street Cemetery in Twain's Delaware Street neighborhood. And it's really funny. That cemetery was in such bad shape that Twain envisions cadavers and skeletons abandoning it and walking by his house to chat, and they have their coffins slung over their shoulders. Watterson, of course, went on to fame as creator of the Calvin and Hobbes comic strip. And here's just part of the text of Curious Dream. The stories and the illustrations are, reprinted in my new book. Then, from the pages of the Buffalo News of 2013 and 2014, Adam Ziglis contributes caricatures of Twain on the front and back book covers. And just last year, Adam drew 2 more original illustrations for the book to accompany a long-forgotten fall of 1869 Express story by Twain entitled Arthur. I hope you have a chance to read it. It's about Twain's report of a whirlwind tour of Buffalo that Prince Arthur, Queen Victoria's teenage son, made of Buffalo. And it's a satirical masterpiece, as are Adams' new drawings. And Arthur has never before been illustrated. As you know, Adam Ziglis won a Pulitzer Prize too for his Buffalo News editorial cartoons. Finally, Twain himself in 1870 was intrigued by how the press had been sensationalizing the slow buildup to the Franco-Prussian War, and he seized it as a great opportunity for satire. So he fabricated an elaborate hoax by publishing a phony war dispatch with his byline and zany headlines, and then a hilarious map that mocked the French military as incompetent. And this is just a teaser of that map. The headlines, the map, Twain's story are also in my book, appearing exactly as they did in 1870. I'll close with a portrait of Twain, which he posed for at a studio near the Express office in 1870, around the time that his war spoof was published. Notice the absence of his mane of wild woolly hair and white suit. They weren't his trademarks yet. In Buffalo, while in his early 30s and mid 30s, he typically wore this kind of outfit, a conservative dark tie and jacket, and his well-trimmed hair and mustache were russet colored. For more information about Twain's in Buffalo, his uneasy relationship with Theodore Roosevelt, his business connection to the Langdon Coal Company, and his life as the life of his Express colleague, John Harrison Mills, I invite you to explore my website at thomasreigstad.com. Again, my new book is officially being released today, and thank you so much for the opportunity to speak as part of the Imagining Greater Buffalo series. I'd like to especially thank Dennis Galucki, Ann Conable, and Allison Hanson, and Joy Testa. And I'd be happy to address any questions that you may have.
Tom, that was wonderful. Thank you very much. My video is not clicking in here, but we'll get there eventually. Question I have is, are there any oh well, there we go. Are there any surprises that really affected your way of looking at Mark Twain because of his period of time here in Buffalo?
Well, yes, I guess one of the things that all my research confirmed for me was that he had decided at some point, maybe midway through the 17 months that he lived in Buffalo, to abandon journalism. And with the advantage of the inheritance that Olivia got from her dad, who died while they were living in Buffalo, he was able to pretty much set himself up for a life as a man of letters, to write books, novels, books of nonfiction. Even though he clung to the hope of maybe starting up his own newspaper in Buffalo toward the bitter end. But it was a transitional moment, transformative moment for him, the time in Buffalo.
Mm-hmm.
I also think that it was a time in his evolution as a man where he outgrew the racism that he was born into in the South, in Missouri. And he benefited from being associated with the Langdon family, who were abolitionists, and he got so close to them that he even wrote an anti-racist editorial in the early days of the Buffalo Express. So those were two revelations to me that I tried to share in publishing about my research.
And that question was prompted to some degree by your prologue in Scribbling for a Living. The title, "I will always confine myself strictly to the truth." And that's what I wondered, whether his experiences here, whatever, something changed so that he had a sense of truth and would feel so strong about it that you would especially begin your book with that, basically.
Mm-hmm. Well, actually, I think there's a little bit more to that quote. It was lifted from his salutatory address, his opening column, where he introduced himself to the Buffalo readership. And he made a caveat that unless it's inconvenient, he'll always stick to the truth. So what you see in his Buffalo Saturday features, especially all of the 10 that are in my book, that he it's fact and fiction kind of combined. He was really good at that. That's what his first best-selling book, The Innocents Abroad, the posture was too. He would fabricate, he would invent, but still it was based on factual, sites that he saw and people that he met and that sort of thing. So he continued that kind of habit of melding fact with fiction, truth with, invention in his Buffalo Express stories.
Good point. All right. Anybody, do we have any questions from the library report?
I am not seeing any questions so far, but I do have one for Tom myself. Tom, you have done such exhaustive research about Twain during his life here in Buffalo. I mean, literally, I feel like in Scribbling for a Living, you literally walked in his footsteps everywhere that he was. Is there anything about Twain that you still feel is unexplored that you would still like to research going forward?
Well, I think I'm not sure that it's been done before, but the time period between 1890 and 1900, some scholars have dwelled on that, and there's a lot of writing done, but I'd like to poke around in that area more. It's filled with tragedy. His youngest daughter, Susie, his favorite, died during that time period. And he also, by the mid 1890s, faced bankruptcy. And he had to, even to afford just living, he had to sell his home in Hartford, Connecticut, and live more cheaply in Europe, in Vienna and in Italy. And he, to his credit, he returned to the States and did a world wide tour where he made gobs of money and was under the financial direction of Henry Rogers, Huddleston Rogers, who was an executive in the Standard Oil Company. And together they worked Twain out of debt. And by the time he died in 1910, he was solvent and left quite a nice inheritance for his only surviving child, a daughter named Clara. But that decade where he struggled to write, struggled to lecture, pushed through tragedy and illness. He had all sorts of ailments himself, and conquered bankruptcy is one I think that needs to be kind of written about with the struggle and the triumph in more detail. And I'm kind of eager to look into that sometime.
Mm-hmm. Okay. We do have an additional question. Did Tom Towles draw any additional Twain cartoons after he moved to Washington and joined the Washington Post?
That's a very good question, and I do not know. Yeah, I'm not familiar with any. I know Tom had sort of forgotten the ones that he did for the Sunday magazine until I, contacted him to seek permission to reprint them. But I don't know if he did more at the Buffalo News or at the Washington Post, where he finished his distinguished career. Sorry.
And if I could ask you or Tom, the importance of the manuscript that the library holds and is in an exhibit. And I'm wondering, they've created a great space as an exhibition of Mark Twain. Do other cities have Mark Twain types of museums or anything? Is there a Mark Twain circuit that people go on around the country and we're part of it, perhaps? Your awareness of such an item.
Well, let me go first, Tom, but you know more about this than I do. I would venture to say that Mark Twain is kind of like Edgar Allan Poe, that any city that can lay claim to anything about him would do so. I think it's my understanding that the major places that celebrate Mark Twain and his work would be Elmira. And there also is the Mark Twain Archive at UC Berkeley out in California. But I don't know, I'm sure there's stuff in Hannibal, Missouri, but I've never been there.
Yes, Hannibal is a center for Twain, tourism. His house where he grew up is preserved, and there's a museum, and they have a festival every summer with parades and things, and every business is named, like the Becky Thatcher ice cream parlor and that sort of thing. And yeah, as you mentioned, Elmira, Berkeley, in Hartford, Connecticut, the beautiful home that he had built with a lot of Olivia's inheritance money, where they lived for 17 years and raised their 3 daughters, is preserved beautifully. And it has they give tours. There's a museum there. It's part of an old artist colony. His neighbor was Harriet Beecher Stowe. Another neighbor was Charles Warner, Dudley Warner, a writer and reporter. And there's a research facility on the grounds as well. So yeah, Hannibal, Hartford. A lot of people go to Virginia City, Nevada too. There's a museum there. I've never been there. But Twain, before he came to Buffalo, and before he even went on that Innocents Abroad trip, he was a reporter in the Nevada Territory. That's where he spent the Civil War time. And I think there's a museum there, and samples of some of the newspapers where he reported from.
Great. Well, one of the themes that we explore, one of our 2 themes, is to imagine Greater Buffalo as a premier cultural and nature center. And Mark Twain's exhibit at the, not only that, but where he lived, that sort of thing, as you beautifully pointed out, in town, and had the tragedies that he's had, but had the beginnings of who Mark Twain would become. Right here in Buffalo is noteworthy, Yeah,
and as you mentioned, Dennis, the Mark Twain room here in the library is a gem for tourists. And there's in the Reader's Park outside the library, that ring of the Twain's name is stamped there. And there's a banner right on Washington Street with Mark Twain's likeness. There are other, remnants of Twain all over the city that could be part of a circuit for Twain enthusiasts.
Along with maybe someday a tour will develop in Forest Lawn of all the folks that impacted his life are probably buried there. All right, Tom, thank you very much for the update, and congratulations on the new book. Best of luck with it. I'm sure there'll be a copy of at the library, and if there are soon, let's put it that way.
Thank you, Dennis.
Put your reservation. You're quite welcome, Tom. All right, folks, thank you for joining us today, and certainly hope to see you next week. Susie Molnar is going to be our speaker. Now, Susie is the Learning Through Play coordinator at our wonderful new town square space at the Buffalo AKG Art Museum. It should be fascinating. This is a joint effort with the Lego Foundation, unique joint effort with them. So we'll be anxious to hear how this is impacting what the hopes are for this space. I've watched it. It's a very busy space of people having a good time. And most importantly, it's a free space. Okay, I'm Dennis. Thank you again for joining us. I'm Dennis Galucki. Be well and good day.